Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
Good morning, I'm Nathan Hager.
And I'm Karen Moscow. Here are the stories we're following today.
Karen, we begin with the latest on a breaking story. Dock workers have walked out of every major port on the U.S. East and Gulf coasts. Let's bring in Bloomberg's John Tucker with the details. John.
And Nathan, this was the scene at Maher Terminals in Elizabeth, New Jersey.
Nothing's going to move without us. Nothing.
That's union leader Harold Daggett. Some 45,000 members of the International Longshoremen's Association hit the picket lines at midnight. This is a strike over wages and automation that could reignite inflation and cause shortages of goods if it goes on more than a few weeks. The strike is impacting 36 ports. The affected ports have the combined capacity to handle as much as half of all U.S. trade volumes, and the strike will halt container cargo and auto shipments. Energy supplies and bulk cargo won't be affected. Some exceptions will be made to allow for the movement of military goods and cruise ships. The White House had been in communication with the two sides over the weekend, and some progress had been reported on wages. The Taft-Hartley Act of 1947 does allow President Biden to intervene in labor disputes that involve national security. In New York, I'm John Tucker, Bloomberg Radio.
All right, John, thank you. Well, tonight, vice presidential nominees J.D. Vance and Tim Walz will face off in what could be the final debate before the November election. Bloomberg's Amy Morris has details from Washington.
The 90-minute debate will be in New York. Walz was asked about debate prep.
Governor, how are you feeling about debate prep?
Going great. This is the fun part.
Last month, Vance said he was already deep into debate prep.
Well, I found a good friend from back home who embellishes and lies a lot, and I'm having him stand in for Tim Walz. That's what we're doing during our debate.
The latest Bloomberg News Morning Consult poll of registered voters in 7 swing states shows Walz with a higher net favorability rating than Vance. There will be no opening statements and no studio audience. Mics will be live throughout the event. Moderators can mute the mics at their discretion. Pre-written notes are not allowed on stage, but they'll have pens, paper, and water. Each candidate has 2 minutes for closing statements. In Washington, Amy Morris, Bloomberg Radio.
All right, Amy, thank you. I'll catch the CBS News Vice Presidential simulcast on a special edition of Bloomberg's Balance of Power. It begins tonight at 8 p.m. Wall Street time on Bloomberg Radio and television.
Karen, let's turn now to the latest from the Middle East. Israeli soldiers are now inside Lebanon. The Israeli military began what it's calling targeted ground raids against Hezbollah just before midnight local time. We get more from Bloomberg's Michael Heath.
At this stage, they're saying that these are sites that pose an immediate threat to Israeli communities in northern Israel. I mean, the big question, of course, is whether this then develops into a full-scale ground operation. At this stage, Axios is reporting that, citing two Israeli officials, that this was approved by the Security Cabinet and it will be limited in both time and scope. But we also know at the same time the US has been worried, while it's okay with Israel doing this to try and push Hezbollah back from the border, it worries about mission creep, which is always the case once you send boots in on the ground.
Bloomberg's Michael Heath reports the U.S. agrees with Israel that Hezbollah's attack infrastructure needs to be dismantled. At the same time, it is repeating calls for restraint.
Well, turning to the markets now, Nathan, stocks begin the fourth quarter on a winning streak. The S&P 500 has gained for 4 consecutive quarters. It's the longest such winning stretch since 2021. The tech-heavy NASDAQ 100 notched a similar run. Mike Wilson is chief U.S. equity strategist at Morgan Stanley.
You know, I would say 3 weeks ago, myself and most of the clients I speak with were in the camp that we would have a tough 4 or 5 weeks into the election, and then you'd get a strong rally into year end. But I'm starting to think maybe it might be more the opposite. We may stay bid into the election, and then I think we get some disappointment post-election.
Morgan Stanley chief U.S. equity strategist Mike Wilson. The S&P 500 added $2.5 trillion in the third quarter.
But how much will the Fed cut in the fourth quarter? Well, Fed Chair Jay Powell says the central bank will lower interest rates over time. He told the National Association for Business Economics the U.S. economy is on solid ground.
If the economy slows more than we expect, then we can cut faster. If it slows less than we expect, we can cut slower, and that's really what's going to decide it. But I think from a base case standpoint, we're looking at it as a process that will play out over some time, not something that we need to go fast on.
Fed Chair Jay Powell said he remains confident inflation will continue moving toward the Fed's 2% target. He added that economic conditions have set the table for a further easing of price pressures.
Well, Nathan, Larry Fink is speaking out about the strength of the economy. The BlackRock chairman sat down with Bloomberg's Francine Lacqua at the Berlin Global Dialogue 2024 conference earlier this morning.
We spend so much time focusing on the segments that are doing poorly, and I'm not trying to suggest that's not the right thing to do, but we're not looking at it in the holistic way that other parts of the economy are doing really, really well. Look at corporate earnings overall. They've been very strong. And I think they're going to continue to be very strong. We do have segments of the economy that are very strong, and I think that's why I don't know why we talk about a hard or soft landing. We're continuing. We're going to grow at 2 to 3%.
BlackRock Chairman Larry Fink says the market is pricing too many interest rate cuts from the Fed, given the U.S. economy continues to grow.
In the meantime, Karen, let's turn to some company news now. CVS Health is conducting a strategic review of options, including a possible breakup. Sources say the options under consideration include the various forms that a potential breakup could take, including a separation of the company's retail and insurance businesses. CVS has been grappling with falling profit margins at its retail pharmacies and rising costs of patient care from Aetna, which generates about a third of its revenue.
Well, Nathan, Pfizer has raised about $3.2 billion from the sale of Haleon shares as it further reduces its stake in the UK consumer health company. Haleon was formed from a combination of GSK and Pfizer's consumer health units. The company makes a wide range of products, including Panadol pain relief tablets and Centrum vitamins.
Now, here's another company you've heard of, Karen. Dell. Michael Dell has unloaded more of his namesake company's stock. He sold 10 million shares worth almost $1.25 billion. It is his second significant sale in the month of September. Earlier, Michael Dell sold 10 million shares worth nearly $1.2 billion. The company's benefited from the wave of investor interest in artificial intelligence companies. The stock has jumped 55% this year. Dell Technologies joined the S&P 500 last week after a decade off the index.
And it's time now for a look at some of the other stories making news in New York and around the world. And for that, we're joined by Bloomberg's Michael Barr. Good Tuesday morning, Michael.
Good morning to you, Karen. North Carolina Governor Roy Cooper says that recovery from the catastrophic damage left behind by Helene last week will be a monumental task as several towns and cities report severe, lasting damage to their infrastructure. At least 130 people are dead and more than 600 people are unaccounted for in Buncombe County, where communications have been down and roads are impassable. Main roads into Asheville were washed away or blocked by mudslides. The city's water system is also badly damaged. This man who owns a car wash says his business is in ruins.
Every piece of equipment I have is pretty much upside down or sideways. I've been told I'm not going to have power for at least 2 weeks or so.
President Biden was asked about getting FEMA aid to people who are stranded.
The question is not whether we get more. This is a list of every resource we're getting in there. But the question is how to get it in. It's hard to get it from point A to point B. It's hard to get it if some of these roads are wiped out.
President Biden plans to survey the devastation in western North Carolina tomorrow. Vice President Kamala Harris stopped by FEMA headquarters in Washington as FEMA mounts recovery efforts in the aftermath of Helene. Harris thanked FEMA workers and said she plans to visit the affected areas.
To everyone who has been impacted by this storm, and to all of those of you who are rightly feeling overwhelmed by the destruction and the loss, our nation is with you.
Former President Donald Trump visited Valdosta, Georgia yesterday, one of the many areas devastated by Helene.
Throughout the region, our hearts are with you, and we are going to be with you as long as you need.
Trump also claimed falsely that Georgia's Governor Brian Kemp had not been able to reach Joe Biden. Kemp refuted Trump's allegation and says he talked with the president Sunday. A Georgia judge struck down the state's abortion law, which took effect in 2022 and effectively prohibited abortions beyond about 6 weeks of pregnancy. Fulton County Superior Court Judge Robert McBurney wrote in his order that the law violates Georgia's Constitution and privacy protections. The news was welcomed by Jalen Black, spokeswoman for Planned Parenthood Southeast.
Effective immediately, in accordance with the law, we are providing and expanding our abortion health care.
Georgia Attorney General confirms that they are planning to appeal the decision. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Michael Barr. This is Bloomberg, Karen.
All right, Michael Barr, thank you. And it's time now for the Bloomberg Sports Update, brought to you by Tri-State Audi. And here's John Stashower. John, good morning.
Good morning, Karen. Since news last night of the passing of Pete Rose, it's been said by many that he lived a complicated life. His playing career was legendary. Played in more games than anyone. Had the most hits. 4,256. The complication came in the late 1980s when Rose was managing the Cincinnati Reds, the team that he had starred for. As details of his gambling came out, Rose agreed to a lifetime ban, and the Hall of Fame changed its rules to not allow anyone banned be considered for induction. It took Rose 15 years to finally admit that he gambled on baseball. He also served 5 months in prison for tax evasion. Pete Rose, Charlie Hustle, was 83. It's been called the greatest regular season game in Mets history, and Atlanta needed one win to make the playoffs. The Mets shut out for 7 innings, scored 6 runs in the 8th, gave up 4 in the bottom of the 8th. The Mets were then 2 outs from defeat.
His first pitch to Lindor. Swinging a high fly ball, well hit right center. Harris going back. It's on the way. It is gone. Into the Braves bullpen in right center field. Francisco Lindor has an MVP moment. Whether he wins one or not, he has just put the Mets back on top. 8-7.
That was the final, and that was Howie Rose, Mets radio. Edwin Diaz gave up the lead in the 8th inning, but still got the save in the 9th. The Braves also playoff bound as they won the second game of the doubleheader 3-0. The postseason begins today. The Mets play game 1 of a best-of-3 in Milwaukee, starting at 5:30. 2 Monday nighters. Tennessee won 31-12 at Miami. Both teams are 1-3. Detroit beat Seattle 42-29. Both are 3-1. Lions QB Jared Goff threw 18 passes, completed all 18. That's an NFL record. Also passing away yesterday, NBA Hall of Famer Dikembe Mutombo, who had battled brain cancer. He was 58. John Stashower, Bloomberg Sports. Karen and Nathan.
All right, John, thank you. And the Bloomberg Sports Update is brought to you by Audi. Visit your Tri-State Audi dealer today and get behind the wheel of the Audi model you've always wanted.
Coast to coast on Bloomberg Radio, nationwide on Sirius XM, and around the world on Bloomberg.com and the Bloomberg Business app. This is Bloomberg Daybreak.
Good morning. I'm Nathan Hager on the morning before what could be the final debate ahead of a presidential election that is now just 5 weeks away. Republican J.D. Vance and Democrat Tim Walz square off tonight in the CBS News vice presidential debate. Ahead of it, we are joined by Jennifer Lawless, professor and chair of politics at the University of Virginia. Jennifer, good morning. And just in time for this debate, we have a major port strike underway. What is the potential political impact of this port strike with the economy front and center for so many voters?
Well, good morning. If the strike lasts a couple of days, voters probably won't feel much. The businesses can pick up the slack. There won't be that many layoffs in the transportation industry, and things will probably be fine. But if it lasts longer than that, people don't need to think back that far to the supply chain issues they remember during the pandemic. And that obviously doesn't help the Democrats as people go to the polls.
Do you expect this to play into the debate with an economic focus so much front and center?
I do, but I also expect both candidates to link it to their own economic policies and to provide voters with the confidence that they think they need to not let this really affect the messaging going into November. What makes it difficult, of course, is that we're only within the first 24 hours of the strike, so it's hard to know what the future will look like.
We've heard so much messaging leading up into this debate that can fit into really tiny sound bites for both candidates. Tim Walz has called J.D. Vance and former President Trump weird. J.D. Vance has been talking about Haitian migrants eating people's pets. Where do you see this debate going? Can it focus on substance, or are we going to get a fiery personality play tonight?
I think it'll probably be a little of both. Unlike the presidential debates, both that Donald Trump had with Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, the microphones will not be muted. So the candidates will be able to engage with one another a little bit more directly than we've seen in the past. Moreover, we know that both candidates have been very, very outspoken when it comes to their opponents, which means that when J.D. Vance says something that Tim Walz does not like or that he thinks might not resonate with the American people, it's likely that Tim Walz will call him a name like weird. And when Tim Walz says something that J.D. Vance Vance thinks is not true or not accurate, perhaps regarding his military record, it's likely that Vance will step in and interrupt as well. So my expectation is there will be a few more explicit fireworks between the candidates.
Yeah, the vice presidential candidates tend to act as attack dogs. But when you have two candidates like this who are so far apart, not just politically, but in the polls in terms of likability, is there a risk of that attack dog role going too far and potentially affecting things up ticket?
Well, it's difficult to see how J.D. Vance's popularity could go any lower. He's among the most unpopular candidates heading into Election Day that we've ever experienced. And Donald Trump really doesn't seem to be taking a hit because of him. Voters seem to be able to differentiate Vance from Trump. As far as Tim Walz is concerned, he is very likable, so he needs to make sure that he remains affable in delivering those attacks. But he's been doing that on the campaign trail for several months now and seems to understand that role and how to perfect it.
Just the fact that this could be the last debate before the election, does that put more stakes on how these candidates need to perform tonight? Got about a minute left.
Well, the reality is that vice presidential debates typically don't decide elections. They usually don't move the needle much at all. But this is the last opportunity for the campaigns in front of a very large viewing national audience can make their case. So my expectation is that Vance is going to really hammer home the Trump team's concerns about the economy, immigration, and crime. And Walz is going to do his best to demonstrate not only that a Harris-Walz administration is different from a Biden-Harris administration, but also that reproductive rights and civil liberties are on the ballot on Election Day.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak, your morning podcast on the stories making news from Wall Street to Washington and beyond.
Look for us on your podcast feed by 6 a.m. Eastern each morning on Apple, Spotify, or anywhere else you listen.
You can also listen live each morning starting at 5 a.m. Wall Street time on Bloomberg 1130 in New York, Bloomberg 99.1 in Washington, Bloomberg 92.9 in Boston, and nationwide on Sirius XM Channel 121.
Plus, listen coast to coast on the Bloomberg Business app, now with Apple CarPlay and Android Auto interfaces.
And don't forget to subscribe to Bloomberg News Now. It's the latest news whenever you want it, in 5 minutes or less. Search Bloomberg News Now on your favorite podcast platform to stay informed all day long. I'm Karen Moscow.
And I'm Nathan Hager. Join us again tomorrow morning for all the news you need to start your day right here on Bloomberg Daybreak.